Great. Good morning, everyone. So very nice to have you here with us. My name is Zhang. I'm a general co-chair of the conference. And the other general co-chair is James Cousins. Unfortunately, he cannot join us in person. First of all, welcome to the UAI 2023 conference at the Carnegie Mellon University. It's so nice to have you here with us. And the banquet is on Wednesday, which is tomorrow. So it's a very nice place. Don't forget to go there. And if you have any questions or need any help, please find our volunteers. You can see volunteer on their badges. Okay. And please stay healthy. We provide face masks and some rapid test kits at the registration table. So if you need anything, just collect it. And in case someone does not feel well, please take a break. And if you need anything, just let us know. So before we start, let's thank our program chairs, Robin Evans and Ilya Spirtes, and their team. Thank you very much for producing the wonderful program. And also, I would like to thank our local team, local arrangement team, including Nick, Lisa. We'll see the pictures and actually see them in person in the town hall meeting. Nick, Lisa, Arthur, Biwei, Aditya, Youngsek, and Yujia. And then I would like to thank our sponsorship chairs, Rosemary and Deborah, and our sponsors, including, as you can see from here, Google DeepMind, JP Morgan, MBZI, IBM Research, and CMU. In last but not least, let's thank I would thank the conference right here, conference and event services of CMU, especially Jamie and Dallas, a philosophy department, and the District College of CMU. Actually, from the very beginning, CMU, especially the causality group, has been quite engaged in the UAI conferences. In 1993, Peter Spirtes, who is here, Clark Glimmer, and Richard Scheines, who will give the opening remarks, published the book, Causation Prediction and Search. Basically, it made a lot of things in causal inference clear, and it helped create the field of causal discovery. And the causality is kind of one of the main fields UAI focuses on. So, and since 1991, you can see the group had been extensively publishing UAI papers, as you can see from the very small part of the list. And so now let me just introduce our best family dean of District College of CMU, Richard Scheines, to you, and I would like to invite him to give us opening remarks. Richard, are you online?
I am online.
He cannot join us today in person, but he'll come back very soon. Richard, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, yes, good.
So thank you, Kuhn, and welcome everyone. I'm Richard Scheines. I'm the Dean of the Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and I'm a professor in the philosophy department. And this for me is really a big delight. I'm very happy to have UAI at Carnegie Mellon and in the home that I have had academically for my entire career. And I'll say a few words about why this is so gratifying to the institution and to me in a second. But first, let me just stop again and thank the organizing committee and the people who did all the work on the program committee. I've done program committee and reviewing work for UAI. I know it's astonishingly hard. It's a lot of papers to read, and so many of them are good. It's difficult to figure out what's what. So big thanks to everyone who helped. And I think that the kind of work that represents has made UAI one of the best conferences in this area in the world. And I'm a dean, and so what happens in promotion and tenure is when I present a case to the other people in the university at the dean's level or the provost level, one of the questions that always comes up is, is the candidate publishing in top venues, really, really good places? And when people are publishing in UAI, it's considered one of the top conferences, one of the top venues for people to actually show publications in. So congratulations, it's really important, an important conference. In Baker Hall, which you're looking at on the screen here, is the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, which one would not consider typically to be the place where lots of great work in UAI would happen. That's more of computer science, which also, of course, does publish here. But in this college, there's a Department of Philosophy and the Department of Statistics and Data Science, both of which have had very, very heavy presence in publishing in UAI. So that's just a wonderful credit to, I think, the institution and to UAI. So for me, Carnegie Mellon is a perfect location for UAI because it was really one of the first institutions to build a permanent home that combines what I take to be the study of uncertainty and the study of artificial intelligence computing. And it's called the Department of Machine Learning. And let me just stop to give you a quick story of how the machine learning department formed and why it's so, in my mind, related to uncertainty and artificial intelligence. So you see on the screen Steve Feinberg, who was a very, very eminent and powerful figure in the statistics world, and Tom Mitchell, of course, you know, who is very, very eminent in the computer science and machine learning world. So in about 1994, 1995 or something like that, 1993, the two of them got together and decided that there's lots of interesting collaboration possibilities between statistics and computer science. And the whole AI world was beginning to, I think, ponder more systematically incorporating uncertainty, statistics, etc. So the two of them got together and invited people from all over the campus in statistics and philosophy and business, in computer science, in other places, to come and present each other their research for 5 to 6 months. And we did, and it was a lot of fun. I learned a ton. And the people in the philosophy department got to present about causal discovery. And then after 6 months, they asked the group, well, is there anything here we should pursue? Is there anything interesting going on? And all the statisticians said, hell yes. This is incredibly good for us. We have all this big data and we know what we want to do with it, but we're having a hard time computing because the data is so big now, the number of variables so large, the number of sample size so big. And so we could really use some computational help. And the computer scientists said, absolutely, we would love to be in something more joint, because we have all these great algorithms that are efficient as hell, but we don't really know exactly theoretically what we want to compute. And so the statisticians can tell us in a theoretical sense what to compute. So the forces gathered, and Tom Mitchell headed up a new thing that became a department eventually of machine learning. But it was born in these discussions that were actually directly related to, well, people who study uncertainty and people who study AI. So it was quite exciting. And I think that still persists today as a good sign of how seriously Carnegie Mellon takes the idea of combining interdisciplinary, different disciplines in work like that. Let me also just say for a moment that how UAI was very important to me personally and to the group that I'm in. So in very early times in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a bunch of people, some of whom I'm going to show on the screen now, who took advantage of CMU's very liberal view of philosophy, which really encouraged interdisciplinary work. And we started a project in what I'll call algorithmic causal discovery. This involved philosophy, it involved computer science, it involved statistics, and lots of other things. And some of the people who played a big role in that are on the screen here. You'll see him in a minute, but this is Peter Spirtes on the left in 1996. That's me holding a beer. And that is Thomas Richardson in 1996, who was, I believe, the first PhD student that we had in philosophy. And Clark Leamore, who really started the project on algorithmic causal discovery, is on the right, and that's him in 1984. I couldn't find other pictures on short notice, but that's how we looked a long time ago. And what really happened was that as the project progressed, it was difficult for us to find an audience in philosophy, which was our home, And it was very difficult to find an audience in traditional statistics, even traditional computer science. It was hard to find an audience. But what happened was we did find an audience, and we did find a group to attach to that was really part of some interdisciplinary conferences that made life interesting and exciting. The primary one of which was UAI. We also had AI stats, and NIPS in the early days was so those three conferences were extremely important for the group I was a part of to find any kind of an audience. And so I'm really forever grateful to UAI and really delighted, therefore, to be welcoming it and opening the conference at Carnegie Mellon and as part of the Department of Philosophy, which I think had a great triumph in hiring Kun Zhang, who is now the co-program director, as you've heard him introduce. And we're super proud of having him on board, and it's been great. So I'm really excited to welcome you all. And let me stop there and just turn this over to Peter Spirtes, who's been my friend and collaborator for almost 40 years now. So thank you, Kun, for inviting me to speak, and welcome to you all. And Peter, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Now, let me invite Peter Spirtes, the Mariana Brown Dietrich Professor and head of the philosophy department, to say something to welcome us and welcome all of you, and then share the first keynote speech. Peter, please.
You can see he looks exactly the same.
Welcome to Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon University. As Kun mentioned, CMU and the philosophy department have had a long involvement with UAI. And for the philosophy department, they began as early as 1991. As Richard mentioned, especially in the early 1990s, causal structure learning and automated causal inference was very controversial. It was very difficult to find places that we could publish in, and UAI provided a very welcoming and open-minded venue for papers about causality, and it really helped kind of create an interdisciplinary group of people coming from statistics and computer science and philosophy, all of whom were interested especially in causal questions. So it's very gratifying that CMU and the philosophy department this year have been able to host, sponsor, and help to organize this year's conference. Let me now introduce our first keynote speaker. As artificial intelligence plays an ever-increasing role in aiding decision-making in domains which greatly affect people's health, their livelihoods, their freedom, ethical concerns about such issues as data privacy, data bias, and algorithmic bias are becoming increasingly important. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Alex Chouldechova, who is one of the most prominent experts in algorithmic fairness and accountability. She received her PhD in statistics from Stanford and is currently the Estella Loomis McCandless Associate Professor of Statistics and Public Policy at the Heinz School at CMU, and is also a principal researcher in its Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and Ethics group at Microsoft Research in New York City. She's a member of the executive committee for the ACM Conference on Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency, and has also previously served as a program committee co-chair for the conference. Her talk today is entitled Algorithms in Unjust Systems.
So, hey everyone, while we're working on getting the presentation loaded, I'll just say thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to be here. As Peter had mentioned, I've been on the executive committee of one of the ACM conferences for the past 4 years. I'm just about to rotate off, or past 3 years, I guess, about to rotate off this fall. And I've seen all the work that goes into putting together such a program. So thank you again for inviting me to be part of it and for putting it on in the first place. Hey everyone. So today, I'm not here to overload you with super technical details as the first technical presentation of the conference. And I think maybe when the organizers had invited me to speak, they're like, oh, Alex does some stuff on causality. Causality has a broad interest to the UAI audience. Maybe she'll talk about that. And then I thought about it and said, nah, okay. You'll get plenty of talks focusing on causality from many eminent researchers later in the conference. So today what I'm actually going to be doing is I'm going to be talking about algorithms and algorithmic fairness when those systems are being deployed as part of decision-making processes in social systems that are themselves perceived to be unjust. Right? And to ground the discussion, I'm going to focus most of the talk on the child welfare system, specifically in the US. Okay. So let me give you an overview of what that system actually looks like. So at a high level, the US child welfare system looks something like the following. First, someone has observed something or hears about something that leads them to a suspicion of child abuse or neglect affecting one or more children. That person is often a mandated reporter. So these are individuals like teachers or doctors who are required to report these sorts of suspicions to their local governments. Once this suspicion arises and they want to or are required by law to make a report, they make that report, also called a referral, to state or local child protective service agencies. And at that agency, a hotline call screener makes the decision of whether to screen in that referral for further investigation or just make a record of it and screen it out. For calls that are screened in, caseworkers go out and investigate. They go and talk to the family and others involved. They oftentimes talk to the mandated reporter. And jointly with their supervisor, they make the decision of how to proceed next. So many of the allegations are unsubstantiated or deemed to be sufficiently low risk to essentially leave the family alone. But in other cases, the concerns are substantiated. The risk is viewed to be sufficiently severe to proceed to either offering the family supportive services or potentially, if the risk is deemed to be too great, to leave the child or children with the family, to file a court petition to have the children removed from the home and placed in foster or sometimes kinship care. And even after separation, there are other decisions to be made. So whether to reunify, and if so, when. To give you a sense of the scale of the system, which many of you might not be very familiar with, in 2019 alone, which is the last year for which we have pre-pandemic data, child welfare agencies received an estimated 4.3 million of these referrals that involved 7.8 million estimated distinct children. And as a result of this process, over 3.5 million children received an investigation or an alternative response following the referral. And in aggregate, what this means is that in the US, over 1 in 3 children will experience a child protective service investigation by the age of 18, and 1 in 8 will have a confirmed case of maltreatment. Right? So this is kind of like the criminal justice system, depending on the community that you grew up in. The child welfare system may be affecting absolutely everyone around you and your family, or very few people in your social circles, right? But this is a very, very big system that affects many people in the United States. So algorithms, where did those come in? Algorithms entered the scene at least as early as the 1980s, largely as part of broader efforts to improve decision-making and to ease the sheer massive throughput of cases entering the front door of the system. As laws broadened the definition of mandated reporter, there were, and also of the kinds of cases that the child welfare system wanted to be involved in, many, many more children were coming in through the front door, which is the referral process. So originally, most of the tools that were used as algorithms in the system were actuarial or psychometric tools, which I'll give you an intro to. But in the past decade or so, and this is why these things are now of interest to people in stats and ML like me, the attention has largely shifted to so-called predictive risk models. These are just statistical models developed using large administrative data sets and ML methods that try to predict which children are going to be at risk from administrative data. Right? And again, the hope is not just that we can use data to train a model and say that we're doing something fancy. The hope is that these tools can provide some additional information, distill rich data sets into something more easily digestible, and ultimately reduce noise and bias in decision-making and improve outcomes for families. So according to a 2021 report by the ACLU, algorithmic tools are actively used or have at least been explored by child welfare agencies in at least 20 states. And various forms of tools are used at every stage of the process, every stage of that pipeline that I showed you earlier. Most of the algorithms, as I mentioned, aren't really algorithms in the ML sense. There's some form of actuarial or psychometric tool that rely on subjective assessments or self-reporting during interviews with caseworkers. And what I'm showing here is an example of one of these. This is the CANS, or a child and adolescent needs and strength assessment, that assesses various scales to determine different risk factors, needs, and strengths that can then be used in caseworkers and by caseworkers in case planning. Some variants of these sorts of tools also provide particular recommendations. So like do this, offer the family that, et cetera. And there's been a fair bit of work dissecting and studying these tools in the child welfare specifically. In particular, there's been really interesting work by Devansh Saxena and Cheyenne Guha over the past few years. Devansh just started a postdoc here at CMU, actually. I'm not going to go into detail here on these studies, but they describe how these sorts of actuarial and psychometric tools, when used in the child welfare system, lead to gaming, cumbersome bureaucratic processes, and also introduce conflicting values into the system. What I'm going to focus on instead is a different set of algorithms used in child welfare and many other settings, which are known as predictive risk models. You might know them also as risk assessments. So unlike actuarial or psychometric tools that involve subjective assessments and interviews and cumbersome data collection processes, these PRMs, predictive risk models, are based exclusively on administrative data that's available on children and associated adults. Okay. So these are administrative data sets that are possessed by the agency, the child welfare agency. And it can include things like demographic information, birth records, prior child welfare system history, criminal justice history, depending on how linked these data sets are, maybe physical and behavioral health information, et cetera. And you can think of these models as just regressions that try to predict some adverse outcome that's supposed to be a proxy for harm, which is not something that we directly observe. So some sort of system outcome, like the likelihood that child will be re-referred, or the likelihood that they will be removed from the home, which is called placement, given the observed data. So here's an example of what, for instance, call workers in Allegheny County got to see. Initially, this is the AFST, Allegheny Family Screening Tool, that was deployed in Allegheny County in August 2016, has been in deployment with various iterations since. And what it does is it produces a score from 1 to 20 with higher numbers indicating higher levels of risk. Okay. And that score initially was actually the maximum of 2 scores. It is the maximum of a re-referral risk and placement risk, both converted to a 20-point scale. Now they've dropped the re-referral score. Now all you just see is a placement score. But again, the visual doesn't really change too much. It's still a score from 1 to 20. Right? So this tool was put into deployment to assist call workers with making that initial decision of which referrals should be screened in for further investigation and which ones should be left alone. From the very beginning, there's been a lot of controversy surrounding these tools. So there's been criticism from media and organizations that are quite prominent in this space, such as the ACLU. And many of the concerns have focused on bias and further marginalization of communities of color and those experiencing poverty, who are already largely overburdened by the child welfare system. But rather than focus on the media and civil society organization perspectives, what I'm going to do is I'm going to frame the remainder of the talk around affected community perspectives. So specifically, I'm going to describe some of what we learned about what affected communities think about the development and deployment of algorithms in the child welfare system with which they are involved. And I'll also overview some of the research that's been motivated by the issues raised. So like I said, this is not going to be a talk about causal inference methods and things along those lines. But what I'm hoping is that you might find some motivation and inspiration for your own research by seeing how that process has worked for our group. Okay. So in this qualitative study, what we set out to do, this was conducted a few years back, is to understand affected community perspectives on the use of algorithmic tools in the child welfare system. So specifically, our work examined 3 central questions. We were interested in how do people who are most likely to be subject to or affected by or be users of algorithmic decision-making feel about the deployment of such systems? What are the primary sources of community discomfort surrounding the development and deployment of such tools? And then there's a third question about what can researchers and designers do to improve comfort levels? I'm going to focus on the first 2 questions, and I'll return to the third one at the end of the talk. In particular, it's become clear over the years that that's not the right formulation of the intended question in the first place. So to ground our investigation, we looked at the structure of organizational justice perceptions, which originate in research, largely investigating employees' attitudes and behaviors towards their employers. So in a 2001 study, Colquitt identified 4 central components of organizational justice perceptions. These are procedural, distributive, informational, and interpersonal. You might have heard of some of these, at least procedural, but perhaps not the rest. So procedural justice describes the perceived fairness of of the processes and procedures that produce the decisions and outcomes. And this is particularly important because in many studies of organizational behavior, procedural justice perceptions have been found to mediate the relationship between the desirability of outcomes and their acceptance. And since many of the outcomes or decisions in the child welfare system are actually quite negative or adversarial to families, procedural justice, we anticipate, would play an important role in providing some legitimacy to the process. Distributive justice refers to the perceived fairness of the actual decisions and outcomes. So what actually happens at the end of the day, and is that perceived to be fair or just? Informational justice relates to ideas of transparency and explainability that we're going to be familiar with in this community, and reflects the sufficiency and completeness of information that's provided to explain and justify decisions and outcomes. And lastly, interpersonal justice, which is certainly not something that ever came up in my stats classes, reflects the extent to which people are treated with dignity and respect by those making and communicating decisions. And this is a really important point because at the end of the day, it's not that algorithms are coming in and they're replacing human decision-making. There isn't like a robot going around making decisions. Instead, the algorithms are mediating the sort of decisions and interpersonal interactions that are happening between child welfare staff and families. And so to the extent that that comes to bear on the way that things are communicated, it can really impact people's perceptions of the legitimacy of the system. So we conducted these workshops here in Allegheny County over the period of 2 weeks. And in total, we engaged with 83 participants from 3 participant groups over the course of 5 workshops. And these participants included families who have current or prior child welfare system involvement, frontline providers who are agency staff who are in regular contact with families, and specialists who work at child welfare agencies but do not have direct contact with families. So I'll give you a brief overview of our high-level findings, and then I'll zoom in a little bit into particular points that were raised and some of the follow-on research that those points inspired. So on the procedural front, we found that system-level concerns based on participants' prior adversarial experiences with the child welfare system were readily projected onto algorithmic use cases as well. So this is an important point. It's very difficult to talk about how do you feel about the algorithm and is it just when you believe that everything about the system wholesale in your experience is unjust. Second, there were also concerns, as might be expected, about caseworker data and algorithmic bias, about whether algorithms can appropriately account for all relevant decision factors that families and frontline providers believe should actually go into decisions. And there was a specific emphasis on a human in the loop approach. So no one wanted to replace the existing system, however bad it was, with just a computer model that sits there and outputs decisions. On the distributive side, participants emphasized that their prior experiences with the child welfare system have been highly burdensome, and that they felt that they essentially kept on being roped back in. So you have prior involvement, you're going to get more scrutiny in the future and getting roped back in. And there were concerns that algorithms might exacerbate feedback loops of that variety, which would be very undesirable. And participants also called for the presentation of some concrete evidence that any of this algorithm-assisted decision-making was doing something that they might care about, right? That it wasn't just novelty for novelty's sake, that that form of algorithm-assisted decision-making improved upon the status quo, which again, everyone acknowledges has lots of room for improvement. So participants expressed informational needs, and particularly wanted sufficient information for meaningful recourse and to be able to contest decisions. And also they emphasized that how and when risk information is communicated is critical. The information can provide comfort, or it can actually reify power dynamics and come off as threatening. Okay. So I'm going to zoom into just a few of these points now. First, the systemic issues, then issues around caseworker data and algorithmic bias. Then I'll talk about some of the doubts about whether algorithms can account for all relevant decision elements and some of the ways we can formally study that question or a version of that question. And lastly, I'll talk about some of the evidence that we have coming in as of the past couple of years, now that these systems have been deployed and studied in various ways, on does the deployment of these systems actually change over the status quo? So let's start with system level concerns. So families most strongly voice the concern that their prior interactions with the system have been largely adversarial. So to emphasize, it really didn't matter to them whether the particular decision-making scenario we described had an algorithm in it, exclusively an algorithm plus human. That part really didn't matter. The perception has always been that it's been them versus the system. And so who cares what sort of tools and spreadsheets and rainbow colored AFST scores were behind the scenes. So indeed, one point I want to make here is that while in this talk, I'll use the term child welfare system or child protection system, which most of you probably won't bat an eye at, many reasonably argue that these are misnomers. So they would argue that more appropriate names for these would liken the system more to that of policing, that this is more like a family regulation system or a family surveillance system, or in fact, a family policing system. Right? And that's because it's a system that at the end of the day operates through invasive investigations, monitoring, and the separation of children from their families, sometimes for indefinite periods. And so, of course, some of these actions are warranted responses to incidents of child abuse. But the reality is that most of the allegations and most of the referrals that are being triaged, and certainly all the ones where there's any discretion, they don't pertain to grievous incidents of physical or sexual abuse. They actually pertain to neglect, right? They're referrals for neglect, not abuse. And neglect often arises from conditions of poverty. So while the system's able to connect families with supportive services, that's one of the things that they're set up to be able to do, it's generally viewed as ill-suited to providing the kinds of material supports that alleviate the conditions of poverty in a direct and minimally burdensome and non-coercive way. It's kind of similar to policing, where police are now being increasingly trained on like mental health issues, but they're still not the people who are most expert at responding to mental health crises. Okay? So similarly here, right? So please keep these issues in mind throughout the talk, and also as you engage with algorithmic systems in any of these sort of societal domains. So beyond these systemic issues, all participants in our study raise concerns about the potential for bias in the data, bias in the algorithm, or bias on the part of caseworkers involved in the decision-making process. So participants specifically voiced concerns about both systemic and structural biases in the system and how these fell along racial and socioeconomic lines. So they would say things like, the system here in America just lets us down, especially if you're Black, and also how honest are we allowed to be? Most of our systems were not made for people of color or by people of color, nor do they have people of color in them, except as those who are being marginalized and most directly impacted by those systems. There's one other type of bias that was concerning to participants, and that is bias in the administrative data on which the models are trained. So as this frontline worker describes, My neighbor might be shooting up heroin and their 6-year-old is out on the street, but they have private insurance, so their records aren't part of the system. The computer tool is only capturing people who have to use public health, so there's a bias to poor people in the system. And similar concerns were raised by Virginia Eubanks in her book, Automating Inequality, an excerpt of which can be found in this Wired article. And in that article, Eubanks writes that by relying on data that's only routinely collected on families using public resources, the AFST, again, this Allegheny Family Screening Tool, the rainbow thing I showed you before, unfairly targets low-income families for child welfare scrutiny. Right? So as researchers, what we wanted to do is better understand the extent to which this is true. So the claims have some intuitive appeal, but what we wanted to set out to do is understand the extent to which having more complete data in the administrative data system disadvantages individuals. Right. So we're going to ask this question: are groups with more complete data unfairly targeted by prediction models? All right. So to get a handle on this question, I worked with student Miliana Akvinar, who recently defended her PhD thesis on this topic, and collaborator Zach Lipton, who's also faculty at CMU. And what we did is we studied a very simple model of this sort of data missingness or data underreport. Right? So you can think of the specific thing that we're examining as a form of data missingness with unobserved missingness indicators. Let me unpack that for you. Okay. So whereas previous work on algorithmic fairness has studied the case of additive feature noise, so we have some features and we might have uniform or differential feature noise, depending on group, and has also looked at the impact of missingness, both uniform missingness in data and differential based on group. Here we're in a setting where we don't necessarily know which values are missing. So you can think about having some group G, which let's say this is indicating the individual's medical insurance type, whether that's private or public, and maybe some subtypes. And this might be unobserved. So a lot of the time we actually don't really know on whom are we getting the more complete data. And depending on G, which is going to govern the likelihood that you're actually going to observe the correct features, certain features Z may be less likely to be observed correctly. So instead, we're going to observe some feature X for that. And for simplicity, we're going to assume that all those entries have defaulted to some in-domain value. And in-domain here is important. It's not going to be NA. That would clearly tell us what's missing. It's going to be some in-domain value. In particular, we're going to examine the setting where certain count and indicator features are just going to show up as 0 when they might be in truth non-zero. Okay. So we can think of this as a case of unreport. So when we see a 0 in those features, we actually don't know if it's a true 0, that event didn't happen, or it happened 0 times for the individual, or it's a 0 due to mismeasurement, an unreport. So for instance, if C is the number of mental health visits in the past year, and we observe a 0 there, we don't know if that's because the person maybe had many mental health visits, but they were all privately funded, so they're not observed in the government administrative data, or if in fact the person had no mental health visits. Other features might be correctly observed. So this is something like C2. This could be, say, the number of prior child welfare referrals, which would be correctly observed for everyone, because that's data that the county essentially creates in its record keeping. So we frame the question of, are groups with more complete data being unfairly targeted by prediction models by comparing the predictions that we would get if we were to observe the true features Z to what happens if we observe our unreported features X. So to give you an idea of what this looks like, this is just a mock-up. I'm showing you 2 density curves, and these densities correspond to just the Y hats from regressing Y on the true feature Z, right? So I'm going to have 2 groups. You can think of A as having no unreport, so we're observing all the correct data, the true Z's for group A, and in group B, we might have some frequent unreport. But if we had observed all the true data, so all the Z data, we might have differences in the distribution of Z across groups. So there could be some difference in the Y hat values also. Right? And so then if we were interested in saying, okay, anyone who's in the top 10% of risk, we're going to call high risk, we can look at, okay, what's the fraction of group A, the group for which we have complete data observed or will have complete data observed, that's classified as high risk. And here it's going to be 9%. And we can compare that to what happens when we have unreport in the other group. So we have, let's say, group B, which is a group that's more likely to have private healthcare. So we'll observe a bunch of zeros in that first column, which will be like the number of mental health visits. And we can look at what happens, right? So what you might expect to happen is that for the group that where we have more unreport, perhaps the density will collapse. And so then when we look at the top 10% of highest risk cases, we might find that actually 16% of the, let's call this like the Medicaid publicly insured population, winds up being in the top 10% highest risk set. This would be an example of being unfairly targeted in some sense. So let's try to unpack this a little bit more and see what the results are. Again, these are just sketches. There's a lot more in the paper. So our first finding is that in theory, it's actually not always the case that that will happen. It's not always the case that when you have this form of unreport, that the group with more complete data, right? So like the group that relies more prominently on public services is going to be overrepresented in the high risk set relative to what they would be if we'd observed all the data. So it is theoretically possible for the group with more underreporting to wind up with a more diffuse risk distribution, kind of as shown here, which would have the effect of decreasing selection rates for the other more complete data group. So we could have, in one case, like the Medicaid group would really have a selection rate of 9%, but with this unreport, they have a selection rate of 6%, and they're actually under scrutinized, under selected. And when does this sort of thing arise? Well, you can look at a Gaussian data setting where you have Gaussian features. The feature distribution is the same across groups. The first feature is going to be observed with unreport, and we have a bunch of other features, and everything in ground truth is related via a linear model. And so there's a corollary that Liliana established, some other results that basically says that the group with more complete data will have lower selection rates at sufficiently high thresholds if this covariance condition involving the coefficients holds. Okay. So just to give you a sense of when this can actually happen, suppose that we have just two features, Z1 and Z2. Z1 is going to be observed with unreport, one of the groups. Yeah. And these are both risk factors. So their coefficients are positive. They have a positive association with the adverse outcome Y. And yet, despite being both positively correlated with Y, they themselves are highly negatively correlated. So these are both risk factors, but they are somehow highly mutually exclusive. So in that case, you would actually wind up with a situation where the group with more complete data winds up being under-targeted once you have unreport. Right? This is a setting that in practice really does not arise, which is why the conclusion of the paper is essentially that in practice, yes, the concerns voiced by the participants in the study and Virginia Eubanks are largely satisfied. We looked at a bunch of different data sets, including child welfare data sets, and the correlation structure and the relationship between features and outcomes that you would need in order for this to happen just basically doesn't arise. Okay? So in the paper, I'm not going to talk about this here, but we provide extensive discussion of various imputation and other corrective strategies and explain why, even though in principle, maybe they might work, in practice, they don't really seem to. Okay, so we don't have a very good solution to present here. So let me move on for now. Okay. So the third of 4 issues that I wanted to talk about here is the concern that risk models being developed and deployed might not be adequately accounting for all relevant decision elements. And this is where people have emphasized the need for a human in the loop approach to fill in all the gaps and deficiencies that the algorithm might suffer from. So there are different ways of interpreting this concern in some formal way that's amenable to analysis. And all of them kind of pervert the underlying concern a little bit, but let me walk you through some of them. So remember, at the end of the day, what our algorithm is just going to be some f of x or f hat of x if you prefer. That's an estimate of the likelihood of y given our features x. So The concern could be that perhaps we don't have relevant decision factors in the sense that some of the key X's are missing. We just don't observe them in the administrative data. Maybe there's something that would come up with an interview, for instance, that the families would want to tell you that's relevant. It could also be expressing the fact that maybe F is insufficiently expressive. If we had a more complex, more expressive F, that we'd be better at capturing relevant decision elements, like interactions between the different factors. The third interpretation could be that perhaps Y doesn't fully capture all the relevant decision criteria. This is related to omitted payoff bias. Maybe the thing that we're modeling isn't the only thing that's actually relevant to decision making. And so I'm going to dismiss here the issue about F not being flexible enough. There are certainly many applications where that is the case. That's not the case here. Okay, pretty simple, sparse linear models that don't have any interactions perform just about as well as the most complex thing you can try to fit and tune on the data. So it's generally not the case that the Fs are not sufficiently expressive. Okay. What I'll focus on here is actually the third concern, which is that perhaps the prediction target itself might be limiting and perhaps introducing a source of bias or inequity. So this gets into questions of actually choosing Y in the first place. A lot of the papers that we wind up writing, especially methods papers, theory papers, they wind up saying, like, suppose there is a Y, right? But in practice, there isn't a Y, okay? Y doesn't come preordained in the data. There's no consensus on what Y is. And in fact, in most cases, I have really a hard time positing a case in these like social welfare settings where there is a single choice of Y. We often have multiple reasonable options. Okay. So in the child welfare context, for instance, the goal is to do something like predict which children are at greatest risk of harm. We don't observe harm directly. So we have a bunch of different proxies, observable proxies, system outcomes that we might observe. So we might predict the likelihood of referral, the likelihood of removal from the home, which is out of home placement, likelihood of substantiation, hospitalization, et cetera. The list goes on. In criminal justice, it's common to not just have a single outcome Y. In fact, many of the most popular tools, they'll predict many things, construct many so-called scales. They'll predict failure to appear, new criminal activity is measured by arrest, new violent criminal activity is measured by arrest on charges that are deemed violent. You could predict conviction, you can predict any system outcome that you want, right? And sometimes these are combined into decision-making frameworks that explain how you should weigh these 3 or 4 different risk numbers in decision-making. And then in healthcare, it's fairly common to, at least when managing the health of large populations, to look at some measure of costs, maybe avoidable costs, or healthcare needs. So what's actually likely to happen to the patient? What events are likely to befall them? Okay. So how important is this choice? It's clearly a choice to some extent, especially if you're just going to pick one, but how important is it? So first, it's worth noting that models that are designed to predict a particular target may, by coincidence, be predictive of other targets as well. I'm not saying we should count on this, okay? We shouldn't say, well, I chose to predict this thing, but don't worry, I think it might predict other things as well. We're good. Okay? But as we show in this JAMA Pediatrics article, the AFST placement risk score, so the likelihood of being removed from the home, is actually predictive of many medical outcomes as well, even though it was not trained with knowledge of these outcomes. So the 2 lines that you see here are just different ways of constructing like a valid pre-event risk score to say, okay, well, you know, a year before the event or at some random point before the event, here's the child's risk score. And then we can look at, instead of, well, were they actually removed from the home, the thing that the score is trying to predict, we can look at what is the rate of injury related hospitalizations for children with those scores, or what's the rate of hospitalizations for injuries with maltreatment related ICD-10 codes. And what you see is that these are strongly positively associated, right? If I were to plot actual placement outcomes versus the placement risk score, you'd actually see something pretty similar to what you see here for medical encounters. And we see something similar for looking at the highest risk cases in terms of the likelihood of suicide hospitalization compared to the lowest risk cases. And then just for sanity, to ensure that we're not associated with absolutely every single medical outcome, even when we shouldn't be, we did a little placebo test, which looked at cancer hospitalization. So there's no reason to suspect that cancer has any association with any notion of child abuse related harm. And indeed, not only are we somewhat underpowered to detect an effect if there was one, there doesn't really seem to be a clear trend between this proxy that we think, or this outcome that we think proxies for risk of harm and cancer hospitalization. Okay. Now, as I said, we shouldn't just count on models for some target being predictive for other targets. It's just happened to be a case where it was. So indeed, there's actually a really nice and growing literature arguing both conceptually and empirically that the choice of Y matters. So it's an important part of problem formulation, as Pasi and Barocas have argued, and also it's key to validity, has been argued in the work on measurement and fairness by Jacobs and Wallach, and the work on the fallacy of AF functionality by Raji and al. And in this work with my former student, Maria de Arteaga, we've looked at how do we actually improve the construction of Y by leveraging noisy and imperfect and not the thing you want to trust, human decisions to try to anchor Y more to the sorts of risks that humans might actually care about, but might be hard to capture in any of the outcomes observed in the administrative data outside of decisions. And furthermore, as this highly cited empirical study of Obermeyer et al. Shows, target choice can also have considerable impact on fairness. So in studying a risk score used to determine which patients should be eligible for coordinated care management programs, what the authors found is that there's significant evidence of racial bias stemming specifically from the choice of prediction target Y. So what the authors write is that the bias occurs because the algorithm uses healthcare costs as a proxy for healthcare needs, and less money is spent on Black patients at the same level of need. And so the algorithm falsely concludes that Black patients are healthier than equally sick white patients, right? And so this gives sicker Black patients lower priority for care management programs than their healthier white counterparts. So building on these conceptual and empirical studies in work with my MSR colleagues, Jake Hoffman and Solon Barocas, and our intern last summer, Jamel Watson-Daniels, we set out to more formally study the impact of target variable choice in the context of predictive allocation tasks. So these are the sort of tasks we've been talking about all along, but let me just formalize things a little bit more so we know what we're talking about. So suppose that we have some individuals, these individuals have features X, and they're being scored by some sort of model S. So they might get scores, for instance, reflecting the probability of having an adverse event in their next year. So then we're going to allocate resources, burden, scrutiny to the top kappa highest scoring individuals. So for instance, if we just wanted to allocate to the top scoring individual, maybe this blue person with a score of 93 was the highest scoring among all N, and so resources would be allocated to them. So I want to emphasize that this resource constraint kappas is important. First of all, it reflects the reality that we don't have unlimited resources or burdens to distribute, but also it allows us to put these scores S, which are going to be based on different combinations of different target variables, on equal footing. So it'll allow us to home into differences in who is being allocated to, as opposed to differences in how much is being allocated by different models. Okay. If one model allocates to 90% of people, another allocates to 10% of people, you're going to have huge differences, but those are kind of uninteresting because just the level of allocation is so different. So in our setup for multi-target multiplicity, what we say is, okay, suppose that we have multiple outcomes of the kinds that I showed you, and we have corresponding predictors for them. So we've regressed Y on X for each of the outcomes Y1 through YK. Now we're going to consider combining weights. So these are different weights of combining the predictors or the outcomes. So the first combining approach that we consider in the work is weighted combinations of the K predictors. So that we call this the index model approach. We take the alphas, we multiply them by the Y hat. So that's going to be our index model score. You can also think about an index variable approach where you have a new variable that you construct Y, which is a weighted combination of the original Ys, and you're going to build a model to predict that. And so our question about like how much does target choice matter is now going to turn into a question about how much does the combining rule alpha matter. So place we're going to focus on is just on index models. One thing to note is that if we're just considering the family of linear models, index models and index variables are going to give the same results. Right? And also I want to point out that you recover as a special case the common status quo of, well, let's just pick one of the K targets, ignore the rest. That's if you take one of the alpha Ks to be 1 and the rest to be 0. Okay. So how do we frame this question? Well, there are different ways in which we can ask how much alpha matters. And the way that we conducted this work was inspired on recent work on predictive multiplicity, which examined how the choice of alpha, or how the choice of model, affects decisions at the individual and group level. So we considered 2 notions: multi-target ambiguity, which is asking the question, for what fraction of individuals does the choice of alpha, so the way that we combine these targets, actually affect whether they get allocated, so whether they appear in the top kappa. And we also looked at top kappa stability. So this is asking the opposite question: for what fraction of individuals are they going to wind up in the top kappa? Are they going to be allocated to or scrutinized, irrespective of how we choose the target? Right? So these are this stable set is the population on which you can be most sure that if you think you have a pretty good list of target outcomes that capture many different decision criteria, these are people that no matter how you weigh those decision criteria are always going to be selected. Right? We also look at group fairness questions in this context, looking at, for instance, how much does alpha affect the proportion of individuals from a given group that are selected. And I'm not going to provide the details here, except to say that many of these questions can be framed as mixed integer programs, and we provide MIPS for these sorts of quantities and some others in the paper. All right. So what do we actually get by way of insight if we wind up solving these sorts of problems, right? We can run Garobi and get our answers, but do we care? So to illustrate the findings, we revisited the semi-synthetic data that was released by Obermeyer et al. In the healthcare study that I just described. And as a reminder here, the outcome options here are threefold: total costs, total avoidable costs, and the number of active chronic conditions as a measure of healthcare needs. And again, these are measured for a year from the current decision point. Okay. And what this plot shows is a measure of stability. So we run a bunch of mixed integer programs, and what we're able to trace out is the percentage of patients who will be in the top case set at a certain level of selection, as indicated on the x-axis, no matter how the targets are combined. So no matter how we weigh total costs, avoidable costs, and active chronic conditions. So for instance, here we see that if we are selecting the top 10% of cases, there actually 50% of patients would receive a score in the top 10%, irrespective of how these 3 factors are weighed. Right? So perhaps for those 50%, we can be quite confident that if we think any of these or all of these are reasonable prediction targets, that they're going to be allocated to. Right? The other 50%, we can be less sure about. Okay. So let's now turn to the final concern, which is participants' desire for agencies to actually provide evidence that algorithm-assisted decision-making improves upon the status quo. And as one of the frontline providers put it, it's really upon the agency to justify how a computer tool is better than no computer tool. So the evidence on these predictive risk models is just now starting to trickle in, and most of the evidence is coming from the call screening setup. So again, where we're deciding which cases should we investigate in the first place. So there's some evidence from observational studies and RCTs, and I'll overview them very briefly. So in this paper studying the Allegheny family screening tool, what the authors find is that the predictive risk model reduces racial disparities in screening rates for just the highest risk children. It doesn't affect it for anyone else. For the highest risk children by 9.6%, which closes the pre-existing gap by 98%. The predictive risk model also reduces racial disparities in case opening rates, so which families continue on to have a case followed up by a caseworker by 5.5%, which is 87% of the pre-existing gap. And it also reduces racial disparities in 3-month removal rates. So to what extent are children removed from the home, separated from their families, by 2.9%, which is 76% of the pre-existing gap. So those results are based on an observational study in Allegheny County, We also have a randomized control trial in an unspecified county, which studied two things. First of all, racial disparities. They basically found no impact except for low scoring cases where deployment of the tool, sorry, the colors and shading borrowed from this paper are not the best, so I'm not even going to describe them. But basically what they show is that after, when in this RCT, the call workers have access to the tool, the screen-in rate for low-risk Black children drops to a level that's similar to the rate for white children, and there's no impact on disparities elsewhere. They also look at the effect on child injury hospitalizations, finding that when decision makers have access to the tool, child injury hospitalizations are reduced by 32%. Perplexingly, though, they also find that when decision makers have access to the tool, their screen-in rates are less aligned with the model scores than when they don't. So we're seeing a reduction in disparities. We're seeing a reduction in child injury hospitalizations, but we're also seeing that the decisions are less aligned with what the tool recommends when you have access to the tool than when you don't. I've never seen this misalignment before. The authors don't give a very compelling explanation despite a qualitative study that they ran to try to understand this. I don't know if you have other use cases or if you've seen this behavior before, please let me know. But this is one of the reasons that these evaluation studies are so important. Oftentimes we see things that we don't expect. Okay. So now let me wrap up with this question about what can we do? Right? We can do lots of like quantitative, interesting technical work of the kind that I showed you, but what can we do to raise comfort levels? And in this newer study that we conducted, it became very clear that we were asking the wrong question back in 2018 and 2019. So we ran another workshop study. And in the study, we were imagining new futures with our participants. And while in this new study, we heard many of the same things, that these predictive models will perpetuate bias, increase monitoring and surveillance. We also heard a broader openness to incremental improvement, that perhaps in the meantime, as we're working through issues, these can maybe reduce disparities, as we've seen, or reduce child injury hospitalizations, also as we've seen from the evaluation study. But fundamentally, what participants kept on emphasizing that these models can't do is address the core structural and systemic issues with the Child Protective Services system. And in fact, we got some direct pushback from some of the study participants. More than one study participant questioned our motivation for doing the study in the first place, asking if we were simply trying to anticipate objections so that we can better resist them in the future, so that we can better peddle our wares, publish papers, sell the products. And was any of this focus on data and algorithms actually going to benefit any of the families affected? And so at the end of the day, this is the study that had me perhaps reflecting most on the 5 years of work in the child welfare sector that come previously. And thinking that, back in 2018 and 2019, we were asking about what can we do to raise comfort levels? That's the wrong question in the first place. I think we should more often ask, and we should ask those most directly affected and who have experience of the system, what would actually be helpful to them, right? And then do our research. So where does this all leave us? So at the end of the day, as I've said throughout the talk, it's pretty clear to me that algorithms operating as components of unjust systems can't meaningfully be described as fair. It's just kind of a misnomer. And so they may, in fact, produce improvements or downgrades over the status quo. And this is why I think these post-deployment evaluation studies are so important. It's actually not always clear, and it doesn't always happen, that the formal mathematical properties that you can study of the algorithm lead to the predictable outcomes that you expect when they're integrated into human and loop decision-making processes. But taken alone, these algorithms, even if they kind of operate on the margins and demonstrate incremental improvements, at best, they can be part of solutions centered on policy changes, reforms, or in some cases, when the system is too fundamentally broken, abolishment. They alone they're not the right tools to address systemic issues, but they are certainly fun to study. Right. So thank you very much.
We're running a little late. Let's Just take one or two brief questions. Anybody have?
Yeah, thanks for this great talk. Just curious, does this sort of mathematical or statistical work on this, have you seen in your experience inform like policymakers or like what have, did you see that they learned something out of this too? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I'll just repeat in case folks didn't hear it. The question was like, does this actually, is there a virtuous feedback cycle where not only are we extracting interesting statistical research questions from the community, but it's actually influencing policy? And the answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no. So one of the issues is that sometimes by the time the research is done, decisions have already been made, and getting agencies to second guess their decisions on the basis of research is actually quite challenging because it's possible that maybe they weren't doing the most beneficial thing. And so it can take time for like that to cycle back. But certainly it influences future decisions. And the work on underreport in particular, I started some of that before the county deployed this Hello Baby system that's now available to all families with newborns in the county to try to identify families at greatest risk for voluntary supportive services. And so there we had a lot of discussion about using behavioral health information, which again is not reported for the privately insured, and the impacts that would have. So the answer is yes and no, but the research timeline isn't always conveniently timed for the policymaking timeline.